Parker Dean, stand up. We don't keep similar relics in the AI era.
If you think I'm old-fashioned, wait until you see what happens when I'm not around.
Let's remove the last analog fossil in this room. That was the sentence Ethan Carr dropped the moment I walked into the meeting. No greeting. No agenda. Just a clean public hit job delivered with the smug confidence of a man who'd been CEO for less time than my coffee had been in its cup. 20 people froze. Their faces caught somewhere between horror and the kind of forced neutrality people wear when they don't want to be fired next. I hadn't even sat down yet. If that opening blindsided you even half as hard as it blindsided me, buckle up, it only gets worse from here. And hey, while you're here, where are you listening from? I love seeing all the places these stories reach, and truly 95% of you are listening without subscribing, which stings almost as much as what Ethan just did to me. So if you're enjoying the ride, tap that button and stay with me for the rest of this story. Ethan pointed at the chair beside him as if summoning a pet. Parker Dean. Everyone. The final obstacle standing between Atlas mobility and the future. His smile stretched wider, a relic from a pre-AI age. The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they were clever, they weren't, but because of everything they erased. 30 years of marriage strained by emergency shifts. The 30th anniversary dinner I missed because a hurricane threatened to lock every major intersection in the city. The night I slept beside a server rack so an ambulance corridor wouldn't fail. I gave my life to this system, and now I was being tossed out like a temporary contractor. A bitter laugh threatened to slip out. But I held it down. The room already felt fragile. Tom, our senior engineer, 58. Dependable. The kind of man who still writes notes by hand, pushed his chair back and stood. Ethan. This isn't the way Ethan shot him a single. Sharpened glance. Tom sat instantly, jaw tight with helpless anger. I stepped forward, placed my badge on the table, and tried to ignore the hollow ache blooming behind my ribs. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't even angry. Just stunned at how small people can become when handed power they didn't earn. Ethan leaned closer, whispering, "We'll be faster without you." That was almost funny, because the boy had no idea he'd just fired the named mobility officer, the only person legally authorized to approve the city's traffic control system, and without me. The entire grid was already one breath from collapse when I stepped out of the building. The cold air didn't sting the way I expected. It just felt blank, like the world had hit a soft reset while I was still buffering. I drove home on autopilot, past intersections I'd personally kept alive through storms, outages, and every flavor of municipal chaos imaginable. Funny how quiet the city seems when you're no longer the one responsible for keeping it moving. As I pulled into my driveway far earlier than any weekday should allow, my neighbor, Linda, was outside watering her aggressively cheerful flower beds. She narrowed her eyes at me the way people do when they know something is wrong, but don't know how polite they're supposed to be about it. Day off today. Parker. I gave her the gentlest smile I could manage. New schedule. She nodded slowly, clearly unconvinced, and returned to lecturing her begonias. I went inside before she could ask anything else that might require honesty. The house felt unfamiliar in the daylight quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful yet. Just hollow. I hung my jacket, washed my hands, and did the only sensible thing a freshly fired man could do, started baking muffins. Blueberry. Specifically, the kind I used to bring to the operations team on nights when the storm sirens wouldn't stop and none of us had slept in 18 hours. Back when I still believed loyalty meant something measurable. Halfway through mixing the batter, my phone lit up, one email, then another, then 40, all from Atlas mobility teams, pinging me with escalating confusion, signal timing delayed, intersection A27 failing to respond, mobility map showing abnormal yellow clusters. I didn't open them. I didn't have to. The subject lines told me everything as the oven warmed. My mind wandered uninvited back to a birthday I never attended, my daughter's 10th. She'd worn a yellow dress, twirled in the kitchen, and asked if I'd be home for cake. I'd told her absolutely. Without hesitation, right before the city's southern grid collapsed and I was pulled into a 12-hour emergency shift. She blew out her candles without me. I watched the video later between diagnostics. I stirred the batter a little too hard. The timer beeped, and I slid the tray into the oven just as my laptop, sitting untouched on the counter, chimed with a different kind of alert, a familiar one. The dashboard I'd coded back in 2013, half joke, half insurance policy, had activated itself. 72 hours without authorized approval detected. Citywide degradation risk increasing. I stared at the message. A dry laugh slipping out, so the system missed me before anyone else did. The muffins rose, the city faltered, and I stood there in the quiet. Oddly calm, realizing Ethan hadn't fired dead weight. He'd pulled the plug on the only person holding the grid together. By the time I finally checked my phone again, the quiet was gone. It had been replaced by the vibrating panic of a company that didn't yet understand how quickly a system can unravel when its spine is removed. I wasn't in the room, but I could imagine the temperature inside the executive board meeting dropping degree by degree as reality finally brushed its fingers across their necks. Later. Larson filled me in, but I could picture the scene perfectly. The board sat in a tight oval, shoulders tense, while Ethan strutted at the head of the table. Trying to pretend confidence was the same thing as competence. He clicked through slides full of buzzwords, talking about AI modernization as if the city's traffic grid were a toy he'd ordered online. Then, Larson, who rarely raised his voice above a careful murmur, opened a red-tabbed binder and read aloud. Slow and deliberate clause 47.3. In the absence of the named mobility officer, the entire system automatically shifts into safety mode. A silence fell heavy enough to bend metal. Ethan blinked, scoffed, and waved a hand like brushing dust off a shelf. Come on, traffic lights run themselves. They've got backup automation. The whole thing's designed to operate without babysitting. Larson didn't blink. They run. Yes, but without Mr. Dean's authorization, they only know one safe pattern. Ethan frowned. Which is Larson turned a page. Priority default. And priority default, Ethan, is red. The word hung there like a dropped blade. Someone on the board muttered something about liability. Someone else cursed under their breath. Ethan tried to speak again, something about system intelligence adapting automatically, but his voice thinned with each syllable. The room had shifted. They weren't listening to him anymore. And then the twist arrived. The wall screen, usually reserved for operational metrics, flashed bright orange. A banner scrolled across in pulsing text, emergency alert. 14 central intersections have entered flashing red mode, congestion escalating, operators awaiting named officer authorization. One of the department heads leaned forward, squinting as if reading it incorrectly might change the meaning. Another whispered. 14. Already. A third pushed back from the table, rubbing his temples. Ethan went pale. Larson simply closed the binder, the thud of it landing on the table sounding uncomfortably final. Congratulations, he said quietly. The system has begun its collapse. Meanwhile, I stood in my kitchen, watching muffins cool and watching chaos unfold from a distance. Cold calm settled into me, not victory, not satisfaction, but clarity. I had warned them for years that stability wasn't magic. It was discipline, detail, and a name on a contract, my name. And as the city's arteries jammed one by one, I realized the collapse wasn't loud. It was silent, precise, and already too far gone for Ethan to outrun. The first sign something had gone truly wrong arrived not through an email, but through the city's public safety feed. I had left it running in a small window on my laptop out of habit, the way some people keep the news on for background noise. But now the stream wasn't background at all. It was a punch straight to the nerves. A traffic camera on East Harbor Boulevard showed a line of cars stretching so far that the horizon swallowed the end of it, headlights stacked like fallen dominoes, horns blaring in overlapping bursts that made the speakers rattle. I leaned closer, pulse ticking faster. This wasn't normal congestion. This was a city holding its breath badly. Switching feeds only made the tension climb. The commercial district looked like a fever dream, delivery vans boxed in on all sides, rideshare drivers turning in circles like confused ants, pedestrians waving their arms helplessly at intersections that should have been guided by synchronized signals. Instead, everything pulsed in a frantic red rhythm I knew too well. Then, the EMS channel chimed. A dispatcher's voice cracked through. Ambulance 12, delayed 7-minute setback, priority route not responding. 7 minutes in emergency response time. That was a lifetime. And I knew exactly why it was happening, without named officer approval. The system's emergency corridors might as well have been dead hallways. Even the algorithms designed to predict and accelerate ambulance paths stood frozen, trapped behind the missing authorization I used to provide without thinking. A sick, heavy feeling settled in my stomach before I could process it. Another alert came through, this time from a vendor dashboard I hadn't opened in months. The IoT contractors assigned to the northern sector had pulled their teams from the field. Official note: no valid oversight signature from Parker Dean. Work suspended. I almost laughed at the absurdity. Apparently, I had become both obsolete and irreplaceable in the same morning. But the humor didn't hold. Not with the chaos unfolding frame by frame. The final blow came from the Department of Urban Transportation. Their message arrived with a priority flag per contractual terms. Lack of named officer approval activates penalty protocol. Fine rate $150 per hour. I exhaled slowly, the numbers settling like ice down my spine. Ethan might have shrugged off professional disaster, but financial disaster. The board would feel that one before noon. I reopened the live traffic map, bracing myself. The screen brightened, then exploded into a painful, blinding wash of red. Every major artery, every central intersection, all 64 primary nodes, every single one had fallen into emergency freeze. The city wasn't just slowing, it was stopping, and for the first time since leaving that building. I felt real fear for what would come next. I wasn't in Berlin, but when Harold Carrington's assistant later told me how the moment unfolded, I could picture it like a scene from one of those political thrillers where the stakes rise in silence before anyone says a word. Harold was halfway through a keynote about resilient urban infrastructures, standing in front of a wall of polished glass and international investors. When his assistant stepped onto the stage, a breach of protocol so severe the audience collectively held its breath, she leaned in, whispered something that made Harold's expression harden instantly, and then came the detail that stuck with me. He didn't speak. Not a question, not a reaction. He just stared at her phone for a full 12 seconds, long enough for the entire hall to realize the man who built Atlas Mobility from a garage startup wasn't looking at stock prices or a scheduling conflict. Whatever was on that screen was worse. He stepped away from the podium mid-sentence. No explanation, no apology. Just handed his microphone to a confused moderator and walked straight toward the exit. The stunned murmurs of an international audience are rising behind him like distant static. Meanwhile, I was at my kitchen counter, watching the city's arteries turn red on the live map. When my phone rang, the caller ID made my spine lock. Harold Carrington, the founder. The only person in that entire company whose words I still respected. I answered, and he didn't waste a second. "Parker," he said, voice clipped but steady. "I need you to tell me the truth. How long can the system hold like this?" There was no point sugarcoating it. And he knew it. Harold hated theatrics, ironic, given his son's flair for them. I glanced at the grid again, watched 3 more intersections flip into failure mode, and felt the weight of the city tilting toward chaos, not past noon. I said. The line went silent. Not the silence of disbelief. Harold wasn't naive enough for that. It was the silence of calculation, a man measuring cost, consequence, and catastrophe in real time. When he finally exhaled, it wasn't anger I heard. It was something heavier. "He fired you in front of the board," Harold murmured. Not a question, a statement, a confirmation of something he'd been told but perhaps hadn't fully accepted until now. I knew Ethan acted impulsively, but I didn't know. He didn't finish the sentence, and I didn't push him to. He cleared his throat, voice cracking just slightly, the sound of a leader trying to steady himself while realizing his own bloodline had torpedoed the company's stability. "I'm on the first flight out," he said. "I'll be in the air in 15 minutes. Another pause. "And Parker." His tone dropped, almost to a whisper. "I don't think Ethan understands what he's done. He was wrong. Ethan didn't just misunderstand the damage. He had no idea the scale of the disaster he'd unleashed or how little time remained before it swallowed the entire city." By the time Harold's plane left Berlin, the atmosphere inside Atlas headquarters had already begun to rot. I wasn't there physically, but Larson later described it in a tone I'd never heard from him, half disbelief, half grim satisfaction. The boardroom, normally a polished sanctuary of polished egos and quiet power, had turned into a pressure cooker with the lid welded shut. The emergency meeting started at 8 sharp. No catering, no water, no opening pleasantries, just 20 restless eyes flickering between Ethan, who stood near the head of the table like a magician whose tricks had all stopped working, and the screen behind him alive with red graphs that seemed to scream louder with every passing minute. Larson wasted no time. He opened his binder, cleared his throat, and read slowly, mercilessly, the clause that had been haunting the company since sunrise. Clause 47.3. In the absence of the named mobility officer, all operational systems shall automatically enter safety mode. He let the final words hang in the air like a death announcement. Ethan stepped forward, sweat forming near his hairline despite the aggressively cold air conditioning. "Let's be reasonable," he began, forcing a smile that twitched like a faulty LED. "We're transitioning into a modernization phase. The old workflows were slowing us down. This temporary congestion is just the system adjusting." The room erupted not with agreement, but with raw, unfiltered outrage. On the main screen, the congestion map pulsed violently. Every minute, another intersection failed, another ambulance stalled, another district reported gridlock. Hundreds of reports were dropping into the system like hailstones hitting metal. One board member jabbed a finger at the screen. Adjusting Ethan. That's 600 emergency calls backed up since 7 o'clock. Another slammed a folder shut. "You fired the named officer responsible for preventing this. What part of that is modernization?" But it was Miriam, usually calm, diplomatic, painfully neutral, who finally snapped. She stood, palms flat on the table, and shouted, "This is toddler-level decision-making." Ethan's smile evaporated. "We just need to stabilize the AI routing." "The AI routing," Larson cut in sharply, "is locked out until Parker Dean authorizes system re-engagement, and you terminated him publicly, without protocol." A dead, suffocating silence swept across the room. Then the twist arrived. A notification chimed from the conference screen, an official communication from the Department of Urban Transportation. The header alone made stomachs drop. "Urgent legal warning to Atlas Mobility Systems." Larson opened it. The room leaned in like witnesses to a slow-motion crash. He read aloud, "Due to ongoing citywide disruption caused by the absence of authorized oversight, Atlas Mobility will assume full legal responsibility for all resulting delays, damages, and public safety risks. Immediate corrective action is required," someone whispered. "We're done," someone else muttered. "This is bankruptcy territory." Ethan sank into his chair, as if gravity had suddenly remembered his name, and miles away, standing at my kitchen window, I felt the collapse echo through the city, not loud, not explosive, but absolute. By the time the boardroom finished tearing itself apart, I had already made my decision, not out of anger. Anger runs hot, frantic, sloppy. What I felt was colder, slower, sharper, the kind of emotion that doesn't need volume to be lethal. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and composed the calmest email of my entire career. No threats, no explanations, not even a greeting. Just a single attachment. The contract. The original one. The one no one bothered to read after the company grew too large, too arrogant, too automated for its own good. My cursor hovered for a moment over the send button, and in that breath I realized how poetic it was. After decades of calls, alerts, and emergencies, the most powerful action I would ever take required nothing more than silence. I clicked, miles away. The email landed in the boardroom like a dropped scalpel, small, sharp, deceptively quiet. Larson was the first to open it. He didn't react at first. He simply adjusted his glasses, scrolled once, then twice, then sat back as if gravity had suddenly increased. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice thin as winter air, "I suggest you read this carefully." A hush fell over the room. Papers stopped rustling. Even Ethan stopped trying to defend himself. One by one, they leaned forward, eyes narrowing as they scanned the scanned PDF attached to my email. The pages looked old, my original signature in blue ink, theirs in black, the notary stamp slightly smudged. Then Larson read the line out loud. Section 12. The named mobility officer may only be replaced upon voluntary resignation or death. The silence that followed wasn't ordinary silence. It was the kind that pulls oxygen from the room. Someone let out a slow exhale. Someone else whispered, "You've got to be kidding." A chair creaked under the weight of a man suddenly remembering how fragile his job security was. But the moment that mattered most came from the end of the table where Harold Carrington, freshly off an international flight, stood staring at the document. He didn't blink, didn't speak, didn't even sit down. It hit him all at once. He recognized the handwriting in the margin. He recognized the clause. He recognized the signature at the bottom, his own. Harold had signed that amendment 15 years ago, back when the company was small, scrappy, and smart enough to respect the people who kept the city alive. Back when he trusted me with the system's spine because he understood exactly how dangerous it would be in the wrong hands. And now his son had ripped that spine out without knowing it controlled the entire body. Larson closed the folder gently, like covering a corpse. The room remained frozen, every executive realizing that the quiet email they'd just opened wasn't a message, it was a verdict, and it carried the weight of the city behind it. When the board finally contacted me, they led with flattery. That was their first mistake. Flattery is what you use when you're negotiating from strength, not when the city's traffic arteries are seizing up like a dying engine. The email opened with phrases like critical need, strategic reintegration, and my personal favorite, your legacy expertise. I admit, the last one made me smile, just not the way they intended. Then came the offer of formal reinstatement with a 15% salary increase. 15%. After 20 years of carrying that company's operational skeleton on my back, they thought a modest bump would lure me home like a stray cat. I read the message twice just to confirm it wasn't satire, then closed it and took exactly 30 seconds to consider my answer. I typed one word, declined, but I wasn't finished. I drafted a new document, short, clean, merciless, 5 bullet points, no sugarcoating, no corporate padding, no room for negotiation. If Atlas Mobility wanted me back, they were going to pay in the only currency that mattered now, control. My terms were simple: 1-2% equity, vested immediately, not future promises ownership. 2, I report directly to the board, no CEO filter, no Ethan buffer. 3, Ethan is removed from all operational authority, permanently. 4, the named mobility officer position is declared irreplaceable by policy, no proxy, no override. 5. I regain full control of Phase 3. End to end. I read through the list once more, appreciating its symmetry. It wasn't revenge, it was structural correction. The difference between emotion and architecture. I hit send. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. 10 long. Beautiful minutes where I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of cooling coffee, feeling for the first time like the weight of 20 years had shifted onto someone else's shoulders. Then the call came. Not from the board, not from Harold, not from Ethan. It was the Department of Urban Transportation. The voice on the other end was clipped, exhausted, and done being polite. "Mr. Dean," the woman said, "we're monitoring the situation closely. The city is concerned about Atlas's stability." She paused, then delivered the sentence that would change everything if you do not return. "We will terminate the contract. No one else is authorized." And frankly, the city doesn't trust anyone else. There it was confirmation that my leverage wasn't theoretical. It was municipal law wrapped in urgency. The board called 3 minutes later. Their tone had changed. Gone was the formality, the posturing, the desperation disguised as professionalism. Now they sounded like people clinging to the edge of a cliff, fingers slipping. "Parker," Harold said quietly, "we accept your terms. All of them." I didn't gloat. Pride doesn't need noise. Instead, I leaned back, exhaled, and felt something settle inside me, a heavy, quiet authority that had been mine all along but had never been acknowledged. Control wasn't being returned to me. It was being restored. The call informing me the board had reconvened came earlier than expected, and for a moment I imagined the scene before anyone described it, a long table littered with forgotten coffee cups, shoulders hunched under exhaustion, faces lined with the realization that the company's disaster wasn't bad luck. It was self-inflicted. This time. There were no buzzwords, no presentations, no attempts to spin the collapse into some heroic pivot. There was only accountability. And unfortunately for him, Ethan was the centerpiece of it. Harold arrived first, still in the same suit he had boarded the plane wearing. He didn't speak when he entered the room. He simply took his seat, folded his hands, and let the weight of silence do the talking. Ethan, by contrast, looked like a man who had just discovered gravity was optional until the moment it wasn't. His perfect posture slumped, the bravado that carried him through flashy presentations replaced by a thin gloss of fear. Larson opened the meeting, Item 1, he announced. Motion to remove Ethan Carr from all operational authority. There was no debate, no counter-arguments, no pleas for reconsideration. The hands rose in unison, a quiet, devastating chorus of raised fingers sealing his fate. The vote was unanimous. Harold finally turned to his son. The disappointment in his expression was sharper than any anger could have been. "You destroyed something Parker spent 20 years building," he said, his voice low but carrying the force of a verdict. 20 years. Ethan. And you broke it in a morning. You could have heard a pin drop. I almost felt bad for the kid, almost. But sympathy evaporates quickly when the consequences are this widespread and this preventable. Ethan opened his mouth, and for the first time since this entire disaster began. He didn't have a performance ready, no monologue about modernization, no metrics, no speeches about the future, just a half-formed excuse that withered as fast as it left his lips. Harold cut him off with a raised hand, effective immediately. "You are reassigned to a strategic advisory role in future mobility development." He paused, letting the euphemism hang in the air before clarifying the truth behind it. "No signing authority, no system access, no operational involvement, a demotion disguised as a title classic corporate mercy, the kind that looks gentle on paper and feels like exile in practice." As the news settled, the door opened and an assistant slipped in to whisper something to Larson. He nodded, pressed a button on the remote, and the main screen lit up not with traffic maps this time, but with a headline from a major news outlet. "The Traffic Prince Who Broke the City." Below it, Ethan's photo arms crossed, confident grin from his first-day announcement now repurposed as the face of a citywide shutdown. The irony was almost too perfect. The board stared at the headline in a stunned, heavy silence. Ethan buried his face in his hands. Miles away, reading the notification from my kitchen. I didn't smile. Not exactly. What I felt was something quieter, steadier. Justice not loud, not cruel, not triumphant. Just right. Walking back into the city's central coordination hub felt like stepping into a life I had once packed away in a box and labeled finished. The sliding doors opened with their familiar hydraulic sigh, and for a moment, I just stood there, letting the sound wash over me. This was the same place where I'd spent countless nights adjusting signal scripts, fine-tuning emergency corridors, and arguing with malfunctioning servers like they were stubborn relatives. And yet, after everything, it felt new, not shiny or celebratory, just right, as I crossed the main floor. A quiet ripple went through the room, one by one. The engineers rose from their seats, no applause, no speeches, just 20 pairs of eyes lifting toward me with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and a respect I hadn't realized I'd missed until it hit me like a warm tide. Tom, the senior engineer who had tried to defend me during the boardroom ambush, stepped forward. His voice was soft, steady, and carried more weight than any corporate title ever could. "Welcome home, Parker." Home. A word that shouldn't have fit a fluorescent-lit operations center, and yet somehow did. I nodded, swallowed the lump in my throat, and moved toward my old terminal. It still held my login, my desktop layout, even the last set of diagnostic tabs I'd opened before Ethan's performance. The system recognized me instantly, humming back to life like it had simply been waiting for my return. The first order of business was restoring the structure that should never have been tampered with in the first place. I opened the continuity protocol and scrolled to the clause Ethan had casually and catastrophically ignored, with a few keystrokes. I added the new line, "This named officer position cannot be replaced by any form of delegation or proxy unless deceased." There, it was permanence, locked in digital stone, not out of ego, but out of necessity. Someone needed to protect the system from inexperience dressed as innovation. As I saved the update, a wave of movement spread across the traffic map, one by one. Intersections switched from red to yellow to green, like the city exhaling after being held underwater. In exactly 14 minutes and 37 seconds, the grid stabilized completely. Ambulances regained their corridors. Car horns quieted. Life resumed its rhythm. The room burst into quiet cheers. Not loud relieved, a soft vibration buzzed in my pocket. A message from Harold. The system never ran because of us. Parker. It ran because of you, for the first time in a long time. I let myself sit back and simply feel the moment. Not pride, not vindication, something warmer. A sense of closure that reached deeper than any title or clause ever could. In the end, I learned that sometimes the world forgets what you've built until the day it collapses without you. And when that day comes, standing tall isn't revenge. It's justice, quiet, steady, and earned. And if this story resonated with you, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps me bring more stories like this to life, stories about resilience, dignity, and the quiet kind of courage that changes everything.